I am pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. George Bradbury, who will share his philosophy on private practice leadership. Dr. Bradbury attended medical school at Johns Hopkins University. After completing his residency training at the University of Arizona, he served in Yokosuka, Japan, as an orthopedic surgeon for the United States Navy. The next 10 years were spent in St. Louis, Missouri, where he served as division head of orthopedic surgery and assistant department head for surgery. In 2006, Dr. Bradbury relocated to Tucson, Arizona, where he began his legacy of impacting the practice of medicine in the Southwest. He is committed to maintaining the physician's voice in the healthcare industry. Currently, Dr. Bradbury leads American Arizona Community Specialist PC as its chief executive officer, where he oversees more than 30 private practice surgeons. On behalf of ArMA, thank you, Dr. Bradbury, for taking time out of your busy schedule to lead tonight's webinar. Without further ado, take it away.
Okay, well, Juliana, thank you so much for the introduction. And I'd like to thank Arizona Medical Association for all the hard work they do. Without the physician voice at the table, we and the patients we care for would definitely suffer. I would also like to thank them for the opportunity to share my perspective on the role and value of physician leadership. Earlier this month, Dr. Gray, the CEO of Mayo Clinic, gave an excellent talk on physician leadership. My discussion overlaps with his in several areas, and I hope to provide another lens through which to view this topic. It is a very large and complex topic, and this talk will summarize my approach to physician leadership. Importantly, I'd also like to thank the physicians of Arizona Community Specialists for the privilege of working with them. They're a fantastic group of physicians, and I appreciate all the support they have been given to me, discussing, analyzing, and responding to challenging issues. During my career, I am fortunate to have held leadership positions from division head up to chief of staff in the hospital, and I have been a board member, chief medical officer, board president, and now serve as CEO for our company. It has been a fulfilling adventure packed with learning and discovery. I'd like to start off with a brief outline of the talk tonight. Many physicians today are in settings different from the historic norm of an independent medical practice. In order to provide context for my comments, I will give you a brief overview of Arizona Community Specialists. Also, I'll share an outline of steps to develop the leadership toolbox. Then I will outline the historic leadership issues for an independent medical practice and the knowledge base needed for leading such a practice. Then we will pivot to what I believe are the critical functions any leader will need to be able to be successful in today's healthcare. It will start with distinguishing authority from leadership and discuss the outputs of those roles. Next, we will review what is driving the need for transformation in healthcare. And finally, discuss some of the essential requirements needed to accomplish transformational change. Arizona Community Surgeons was formed through the merger of 3 independent general surgery practices. These groups came together under a single tax ID number to reduce duplicated expenses and back office functions. They gained economies of scale in a number of areas as outlined: revenue cycle, contracting, benefits, and malpractice rates. They maintained their own individual practice identities and continued to compete at the front office based on traditional distinguishing characteristics. Like many independent medical practices and other professional practices, it was designed as a pass-through organization with no retained earnings or reinvestment in the practice beyond perhaps a shared EMR. Since our founding, we have grown to include other surgical specialties and recently have started including non-surgical specialties. We currently have 30 doctors and 7 advanced practice providers. We practice in all the healthcare networks in Tucson, and in 2021, we had approximately 95,000 patient encounters and performed over 4,700 surgeries. As Dr. Gray noted in his presentation, Most of us did not receive education in business management or in leadership during our medical training. Our training has been in a very vertical hierarchy, premised on expertise and a large but bounded knowledge base. For most of what we do, there is a relatively clear playbook that guides our actions. Now, this next observation may be where I get myself in trouble, but I'll submit that issues come to physicians in the office much like balls from a pitching machine in a batter's cage. They present in a relatively consistent fashion and a relatively consistent pace. With practice, we can get pretty good. But when we enter into a leadership role, we are facing a real pitcher, hurling all kinds of pitches, and some of those seem to be thrown at us. The crowd is yelling. We are having an argument with the umpire about his last call. There are runners on base with 2 outs, and we're down by 2. These conditions seem rather different. Operating in this environment requires a different set of skills with new vocabulary and rules. I would not advise entering into this arena thinking that leadership is just good common sense. It really does require personal development and the acquisition of new skills. My formal education in physician leadership began with coursework. Without prior training, I got beat up a bit at the division chair level, and I had a desire to do better and to be more effective. The CMO of the hospital introduced me to the American Association of Physician Leaders. They have a wide variety of fundamental and advanced courses for those interested in developing the necessary skill set to work in leadership. They offer a physician executive certificate, and that coursework can be applied to master's programs at a variety of universities if you want to go on to get a master's degree. ArMA is offering a very similar menu of coursework led by Dr. Walker, who has worked with AAPL. And after taking one of his courses on quality, I can highly recommend Dr. Walker. I can't emphasize enough the value of reading. Reading in business, leadership, and personal relationships is incredibly valuable. I would also encourage you to read widely in psychology, cognition, and behavioral economics. Writers like Richard Thaler, Daniel Kahneman, Amos Tversky, Dan Ariely, Adam Grant, and others will provide you with insights that I promise will be valuable. Executive coaching can be helpful, and unfortunately, it can be expensive as well. But you have to look at this as an investment in yourself that will help launch you on an exciting journey. Finally, don't try this alone. It is important to have colleagues that provide mutual support within your organization. If you're the only one preaching in the organization, it is easy to become a misfit and to become marginalized. So for quite some time, the physician practice paradigm centered on physician ownership and not on employment. That has certainly shifted in recent years with more physicians becoming employed, but there's some indication that this trend may be reversing again, especially in the specialty fields. So where do independent medical practices come from, and what do I need to know about them? Let's break down the independent medical practice. So typically, these are pass-through organizations, as I've already mentioned. Control over employees, finance, process, culture often rest with the physician owners. They prioritize physician compensation over investment in the means of production, practice enhancement, or strategic activities in most cases. The focus is often on tightening the screws on revenue cycle management, tamping down on employee and supply costs, and seeking higher fee-for-service compensation. Administration in these organizations can be pretty lean, and the people who are in the executive suite may wear many different hats and have many different functionalities. Heads down execution and efficiency is often the mantra in these organizations. Practice hierarchy is often rigid, and it's typically very vertical. Collaborative cross-organizational decision-making may be low, and it was developed in an era of relative stability in the healthcare industry. At that time, most people had a set it and forget it strategy approach. Consequently, change has occurred slowly in these organizations. Every organization has nuances that reflect the structure and forces that created that institution. Typically, independent medical practices are lean, as I've said, and physician bandwidth for practice management is narrow. If you step into a leadership position, you will need to be prepared for doing the blocking and tackling of daily management. These are necessary and important functions that can't be neglected. As a smaller organization, you may find that there are limitations to a variety of resources. Consequently, some business functions may be outsourced to vendors or to other organizations. The savings generated may be significant or may not. And there is an inherent loss of some control when the function is outsourced. Make sure that the cost of savings is worth the trade-off. Also, the governance of smaller organizations may be more informal, and the delineation of who gets to make what decisions may be unclear and lead to challenges. Additionally, when every physician is an owner, there may be explicit and implicit expectations that you will need to understand. It's important to seek out those implicit expectations. And if you're not going to meet those implicit expectations, it's helpful to explain why in order to maintain trust with those that you're working for. You must be able to acknowledge, prepare for, and navigate all of these issues if you're going to be successful in one of these organizations. There's a whole new knowledge base needed for leading and managing in an organization that is different from typical physician skill sets. Developing some degree of literacy and skill in these areas is necessary for leading an independent medical practice. You need to be fluent in operations, and you need to understand how to establish the hardware and software needed for business functions. Financial management is important, and you need to understand how cash flows through the organization and how changes in that can impact the organization's longevity and success. You don't need to be an accountant. You need to understand how to contract with payers and vendors. You need to know where the pitfalls are so that you don't make an expensive mistake for the people that you work for. You need to understand healthcare benefits and retirement plans, how they represent a significant part of the compensation package for your staff and how they impact your physicians as well. IT infrastructure and even more now than ever before, cybersecurity are important parts for any healthcare organization, and you need to have some fluency in those areas. EMR maintenance and governance is always an issue, no matter what organization that you're in. Compliance and legal issues are important. You don't need to be a lawyer, but you need to understand how to think like a lawyer, and you need to understand the obligations that you're placed under by things such as the federal anti-kickback statutes and false claims acts. You need to be able to build relationships and forge partnerships within and outside of your organization. You don't need to be an expert in all of these, and you will certainly develop these skills over time, but you do need to have a working knowledge of how each one of these impacts the practice. It's important to distinguish authority from leadership. Dr. Gray made an important distinction between management and leadership, and I would like to expand a bit on this. Much of what I've covered up to now might be construed largely as management. Managing can be extraordinarily difficult, requiring high degrees of communication, strategy, teamwork, and emotional skills. That being said, management is largely related to maintaining order in daily functionality. Management functions do not direct the course of an organization over time and through an ecosystem. I place this caution sign here to indicate that the talk is entering into a more nuanced and philosophical area of this topic. You're free to disagree with me from this point out. Authority might be defined as the power to direct the actions of others. Management is the output of exercised authority. And the typical focus is on efficient execution of tasks in a vertical system. Leadership is the activity of aligning people to a shared articulated vision and then mobilizing them from the status quo towards a shared purpose. The result of this activity is innovation and adaptation. The focus of this activity is asking questions, learning, and discovery. Leadership typically occurs through building horizontal relationships, and the attitude is one of getting it right instead of being right. As humans, we are hardwired to the status quo. We have a tremendous allegiance to the known. The status quo is easy to navigate, and it produces a historically proven outcome. However, this paradigm only applies in static conditions, and we live in an evolving ecosystem. Organizations will go through a period of growth and development, and unless there's an ongoing adaptation to a changing ecosystem, the ideas and activities of the organization become calcified and brittle. This is where we start to think about the fate of Blockbuster and Borders, among many others. The loss of resilience and ability to adapt will result in loss of position and decline. Without the ability to innovate and adapt, an organization falls victim to the inevitable changes occurring around them. So let's talk about the difference between invention and transformation. Here's a simple example. In 1973, Xerox invested $13.5 million in the Palo Alto Research Center. That's about $90 million today. At Park, they invented a computer, 1973 we're talking about, called the Alto for Palo Alto. This is the first computer with a graphics user interface. That was a big thing. We think about that as a huge thing now, but at that time, this invention was just seen as another interface for programmers and technical users. It was not passed off to the marketing department or the development department for exploration of the value of this invention. Fast forward about 10 years, and Apple introduces the Macintosh computer with a graphic user interface. By establishing the relevance of novel potential and consumer value in a 10-year-old technology, Apple moved from invention to transformation because they recognized the power that this graphic user interface had to transform personal computing. So the ability to transform, adapt, and create new relevance or value is what distinguishes successful organizations. We are living in a period of accelerating change, and like Moore's law, the change is exponential. However, human perception of change is more linear. At any point in time, our perception of change can be represented as a tangent to the progress curve. Unfortunately, these two lines on the graph diverge, and the area between them can be considered the innovation gap. When our strategies and behavior do not account for the exponential growth of the progress curve, our strategies fall further and further from the reality in which we live. As scientists, we all understand the paradigm of migrate, adapt, or perish. For most healthcare organizations, the first option may be physically impossible, and the final option is typically undesirable. That leaves us to focus on adaptation. Since we are not talking about biological evolution, what does it mean to adapt in this sense? A fundamental requirement for adaptation is the ability to change the way we perceive and behave in our ecosystem. Thus, we must bring a degree of curiosity and openness to discern what might need to be different in order to flourish in our healthcare system. As always, structure and process drive performance. A Prius is constructed to be a fuel-efficient personal vehicle, and a Formula One racer is designed for something completely different. It doesn't matter how much you adjust the engines and retrain the drivers, the Prius will never win at Le Mans, and the Formula One car will never be able to get 40 miles to the gallon. Sorry. So if we want to get a different outcome, we must consider what must be different to obtain that desired future state. When we think strategically, we must consider the spectrum of forces that create and sculpt the ecosystem in which we live and grow. Heads down, task focus, and execution alone will not get us through the world we must navigate. We must also lift our heads, notice what's happening around us. The idea of a 5-year strategy plan is comical to even consider in light of the last 2 years. The rate of change in technology, economics, and demographics is profound. And given the rising cost of healthcare and the decreasing Medicare trust fund, it is likely we will see significant change in governmental payment. Also, evolving patient consumerism and retail medicine are likely to play a role yet to be defined. In addition to looking externally, we must ask questions about who we are. Why are we doing what we're doing? What ideas do we hold? And ask if they are still true or helpful. This requires scrutiny of our fundamental daily assumptions and listening to and supporting objections and objectors. Finally, we need to understand the level of order of the environment in which we find ourselves. The degree of order in a situation can range from simple, where there are few variables to consider, all the way to chaotic, where it is not clear what the relevant variables even are. Transformational leadership is some of the hardest work done in an organization. I think we are doing something deeply counterintuitive when we ask ourselves and others to question the system we live in and have been successful in. To call into question the systems that we have historically benefited from is difficult. Confronting and examining deeply held beliefs, values, and perspectives requires a degree of vulnerability and courage. This is difficult because we resist tackling things that do not have easy answers. We live in a world that often lacks clear order. While some scenarios are simple with direct relationships between limited variables and outcome, we often are living in a complicated environment with a wide variety of variables and responses to consider. In complex environments, the relevant variables and responses are nonlinear or irresolvable, and this may be the case for much of healthcare. And finally, chaotic environments like the spring of 2020 challenged us to even identify what variables are at play. This situation calls for action, followed by evaluation to gain understanding. To tackle the resistance to adaptive challenge, we must bring a higher degree of awareness, curiosity, and humility. This higher level of awareness is an essential tool for transformational leadership. As we move from the perceived safety of the status quo to a shared purpose, there is always risk. That risk is a challenge for most of us to face. Leaders must engage stakeholders in honest discussions focused on strategic and tactical risk. They must identify what can be gained as well as what might be lost. What we often fail to realize is that there is also a risk in the status quo. When ideas and behavior become calcified, they may no longer work in a dynamic ecosystem, creating inevitable failure. To mobilize others to purpose, leaders must recognize the fear of loss or perceived loss in others and themselves. Unless you can acknowledge and account for loss, transformation is impossible. As we move from the perceived safety, while all this sounds daunting, It helps to break things down into component parts. First, it requires leaders to realize that what they are doing is not working or will not work soon. No solution is required at this point, just a willingness to confront the need to adapt to a changed environment. Second, this can't be done alone. It requires wide participation across the organization. If this is confined to a select few, you risk creating misfits who can be easily dismissed. Transformation has to start at or near the top and then be distributed widely. Creating a group of people at the front line who recognize the change needed but lack the agency to do anything about it just creates frustration and no change occurs. This willingness to embrace innovation and adaptation must be hardwired into the organization through established teams, processes, and implementation methods. Innovation must become the norm for the organization, not the exception. This can be very difficult work. Creating a space that can keep people together despite high heat and pressure needed for transformation is critical. Creating the space requires the investment of trust, vulnerability, and courage. It is difficult, time-consuming work, and the results can be unpredictable. One must be curious and willing to be surprised by the opportunities of the future instead of living in dread of it. It seems appropriate to reflect on what the future may hold for us. In the last 2 years, we have witnessed unprecedented change that we have not seen since World War II. The entire globe has been impacted by the pandemic and the consequences of it. Governments, economies, social structures, and attitudes have undergone massive disruption. Decisions we make now will shape our future, and I believe that there's opportunity in that realization. Data is the currency of the realm. In healthcare, more than ever before, we're being asked to demonstrate the value we create for the patients and other stakeholders. That requires data. Organizations that are unable to demonstrate and manage outcomes, providing effective and efficient care, will be marginalized and ultimately dissolve. Some suggest that novel entrants do not carry legacy baggage, and that allows for enhanced freedom to create instead of laboriously retool. Legacy organizations may respond, you know what, healthcare is tough, bring it. And if these organizations become more agile, they may have the upper hand. Organizations of all sizes are seeking new capabilities, domains, and relations. The driving force behind the mergers is often the pursuit of new functionality or expertise. There's a movement of specialty medicine out of employment with large healthcare systems, and it's unclear if that will continue. Will they return to independent medical practice, or will those providers align with disruptors? Historically, competition for independent medical practices used to be the practice down the street, and referrals came to us from known and trusted colleagues. Now, there are many upstream competitors trying to disrupt the flow of patients through the system. It seems nearly impossible to gauge the role that technology will play, but it is a good bet that it will be large. Will artificial intelligence, telemedicine, remote sensors, and other developments improve the access of patients to providers and increase the accuracy and refine the management of patient care? In light of these and other issues, it seems the ability to see, think, and act differently will be the core competency necessary to flourish in our future environment. I believe Machiavelli has been wrongfully smeared by many. His book, The Prince, really is a must-read. This quote reminds me of the difficult work that lays before any leader seeking organizational transformation. Machiavelli notes, it must be remembered that there is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, more doubtful of success than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things. For the innovator has the enmity of all who have done well under the old conditions, and merely lukewarm defenders in those who gain by the new. This arises partly from the incredulity of men who do not readily believe in new things until they have had long experience of them. So for me, this quote also holds a key. It admonishes us that we should not be lukewarm supporters filled with apprehension. Rather, we must encourage, challenge, and embrace each other in the service of something better for healthcare and the patients we serve. Finally, I would like to leave you with a comment from Mark Harrison, the head of Intermountain Health. In an interview, he reflected that the focus at many healthcare meetings is on problems. We all talk about economic, regulatory, quality, and staffing problems, and many more. He reflected that he had been to 6 of those meetings in a short span of time, and not once did anyone discuss how they might leverage their position of power and privilege to improve their community. I think that is a sobering thought. And it is something that I ask myself. If you are listening to this, you most likely are in a position of power and privilege. I invite you to consider what you will do with that gift. Thank you for your attention.
Dr. Bradbury, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. Your insight into the role and value of leadership in independent medical practices is very valuable. And I know many of our attendees are eager to ask you some follow-up questions. So we'll kick off the Q&A session. And as our attendees are putting their questions in the Q&A box, I'll start with one of my own. You know, I've had the opportunity to talk at length. And so I have really wanted to know, after hearing you speak with your staff and seeing how well you relate to them, when and how did you realize that you had the ability to lead a team like this? It's a very diverse set of people, by the way.
I'm not sure when. I think when I was chief of staff at the hospital, I really took it upon myself to make those meetings a little less boring, quite frankly. And so every meeting I tried to get people to lift their heads and look what's around them, and discuss topics that weren't just on the consent agenda. I've been blessed with a lot of great mentors who have been generous with their time and been patient with me. So I'm not sure that there was a pivotal moment, but that seems like a good one for today's talk.
Okay, all right, thank you. And you mentioned in your talk there something about executive coaching. Did you ever have the opportunity to use a coach?
So currently I'm involved in a program by the advisory board, which is a leadership fellowship. Mm-hmm. And when I heard about that, I signed up for it, and then the pandemic hit. One of the leaders, the facilitators of that fellowship, I think felt badly that this was postponed for so long, and so he and I set up monthly calls, and he just really for gratis, pro bono, he took me under his wing and did some of that. So I have been fortunate not to have to pay for that, aside from the fellowship, but I do know many other people do that. And there's actually a lot of physicians out there who have coaching programs. And I think that's a great thing because there's some connection physician to physician. Physicians believe other physicians.
Right, right. We've seen that over and over again. We have some questions coming in.
Okay.
Thanks for the excellent presentation. Can you please elaborate on the executive training and how it would help you, how it helps you?
So I think, I listed the bullet points that you need to kind of have some facility with, and organizations like the American Association for Physician Leaders, you can take a kind of a banquet of courses there on quality, communication, legal issues, negotiation, just all of the things that you didn't learn in medical school and residency that are part of the business of medicine. And I think it really is helpful to you to know those things, to navigate the system that you live in. When you don't understand what the rules are, life is really frustrating. So understanding some of those business principles, I think is a real asset. It just makes your life better, honestly.
Thanks. Another Dr. Bradbury, wonderful presentation. There is so much worry about the future of independent medicine. Do you think the only choice for new grads is employment? Is that actual truth? And what would you advise new grads for looking at practice opportunities?
Well, there's no dispute that people are thinking that bigger is better right now. And so large healthcare organizations, typically hospital networks, seem attractive. And there's been a lot of migration to that. And I think, out of the box, they're a really good deal. We do see that after 2 or 3 years, physicians tend to leave those, and there's a lot of cycling through there. So if you want to be in a more stable environment, there may be another place for you. There's certainly, if you're talking about primary care, I think there are a tremendous number of options. Places like Iora Health, which is united with One Medical, which incidentally was just bought by Amazon. So who knows where that will go. But there's Carbon Health. There's just a whole lot of disruptors in the primary care market that are really betting on being able to deliver on value-based care. And I see those as a place for people to go because they typically have resources that might not be available in independent medical practices. I do think that there are independent medical practices that have invested over time in ancillary services and other things that enhance their practice. And I would strongly recommend you to consider that when you're looking to align with an organization, because revenue diversification is going to be important in the future, I believe. And I don't say that to say that the point of medicine is to generate money. Money is the fuel that drives the organization, and it's what you use to drive your purpose. So, as I said, what are you going to do with your position of privilege and power? And the reality is you do need money to be able to do anything. So it's not a dirty thing. In business, you are expected to make money.
Right. You mentioned a couple of buzzwords I heard a couple of times through your talk. Curiosity, vulnerability, risk. How do you, as a leader, help your team to evaluate risk and decide what's appropriate to take on?
Oh, wow. Yeah, so there's a risk is sometimes subjective. It can be quantified to some degree, but sometimes it is a subjective thing, and it is tied deeply to our sense of loss or perceived loss. We recently did we had a strategic planning committee that actually got together for almost a year, and they're still meeting. And it really was open dialogue amongst those people. And over time, they were really able to articulate who we are as a company, what we value, and how we stack those values against each other and rank them. And what are we willing to sacrifice in order to preserve these things? So I think it is a dialogue. They did develop a semi-quantitative way of doing it. And I really admire them for what they were able to accomplish. But risk is something tough, and everybody has a different comfort with risk. But there's also opportunity in risk. People tend to view risk as a negative, and as physicians, we want to eliminate risk, right? We don't want anything dangerous to happen to our patients. Okay, this is something different.
Especially as a surgeon, right?
And if you wait for 100% certainty in strategy, you've lost. You will never have that. I went to a CEO Academy, and they had a bunch of CEOs around there, and they said, basically you might have about 60% certainty before you have to move. And I think physicians want about 90% certainty, and it's a struggle, and I totally get it.
Okay, thank you. Another question here. What is the role of independent medical practices in providing care to resource-limited communities, either alone or together?
I think that if independent medical practices, they have one of many assets, but it can be agility. It's a smaller ship to steer. And I think that there is an opportunity through telemedicine for independent medical practices to partner with rural communities and smaller communities to provide, I view this through the lens of specialty care. But I do think that is something that is an untapped market for independent medical practices to do teleconsultation in smaller markets. That's something that we'd like to look at. And I think that there is promise there.
So your group doesn't do teleconsults yet?
Not with providers. We do telemedicine with patients, but we are looking right now, currently in the process of setting teleconsultation up for some of our specialty providers.
Interesting. All right, a couple more questions. Let's see. Who do you look to for mentorship or inspiration?
Ted Lasso.
I knew that was going to come up.
Yeah, it's got to be fun, right?
Right.
If you haven't watched Ted Lasso, there are tremendous leadership lessons to be gained from that series. I was amazed when I watched it. Jason Sudeikis is kind of standing kind of cheesy on the icon for that show, but there are some really great lessons in there. The CEO of the hospital when I was chief of staff was a great mentor. I still have a strong relationship with him, and meet with him on a regular basis. There are people in our company that are physicians that are going through this fellowship with me, and every day, I learn something from them. So an attitude of curiosity will get you an awfully long way.
Right. So one final question. What do you think are the most important attributes of successful leaders today?
I think patience, the ability to listen and listen to really hear, not listen waiting for your turn to talk. I deal with smart people all the time, and that every one of them can teach me something. So, you know, there's a theologian, Richard Rohr, who says that he prays for a daily humiliation, because it's in that humiliation that we learn something, that we recognize our imperfection and also our ability to grow. So it sounds weird, but a daily humiliation is not a bad thing.
Just keeping it real, keeping it real.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you. Well, it looks like we've come to the end of tonight's presentation. Dr. Bradbury, thank you again sincerely for taking the time to share your words of wisdom with us. We really, really appreciate your presence here. To our attendees, thank you for tuning in. If you'd like to come back to this discussion in the future or share it with a colleague, it will be recorded, and we will send you a follow-up email with a link to the presentation so you can share that around. Our physician leadership course is truly one of the best opportunities for our members to boost leadership capabilities. If this sounds like something you can benefit from, I encourage you to follow the link in the chat and also watch for emails coming from ArMA. Dr. Bradbury, thank you once again for sharing your powerful knowledge of leadership. And to our attendees, thanks for taking an hour out of your evening to be with us. Good night.
Good night.